In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into dust and silence, millions of Germans faced a reality they had been told would never come. The war that was supposed to last 1,000 years had ended in 12. Cities burned, roads filled with refugees, and somewhere between retreat and surrender, entire lives dissolved in the smoke of artillery fire. In January 1945, the Red Army crossed into German territory from the east. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces pushed across the Rhine. By April, Berlin was surrounded. Adolf Hitler would take his own life on April 30th. Germany officially surrendered on May 8th. But for ordinary people, soldiers, mothers, nurses, bakers, the end did not feel like liberation. It felt like collapse. Food had already become a weapon long before the final battles. Allied bombing raids had crippled transportation networks, farms were abandoned, supply lines failed. By 1945, many German civilians survived on less than 1,000 calories a day. Sugar had virtually disappeared, butter was rare, white flour was replaced with substitutes made from potato peels and ground acorns. For years, sweetness had been a memory. Among those caught in the unraveling was WWII Baumann, a trained baker who had once worked in a Wehrmacht field kitchen. Before the war, her world revolved around kneading dough at dawn and measuring sugar by the handful. During the war, she baked for soldiers near the front, dark rye bread, thin soup thickeners, whatever ingredients remained. By 1944, even the army kitchens were rationing flour. When the front lines shifted and her unit retreated westward, WWII did what millions did. She walked. No trains, no orders, just rumors. Rumors of American camps, rumors of Soviet reprisals, rumors that women in uniform would be treated as traitors by both sides. The chaos of surrender was not a single moment, it was weeks of confusion. Columns of German soldiers laid down their weapons along highways. Civilians followed behind them with handcarts stacked with blankets and photographs. Women who had worn auxiliary uniforms, radio operators, medics, kitchen staff, tried to blend into civilian crowds. Some burned documents, some cut insignia from their coats. All of them feared what would happen if they were captured. Nazi propaganda had spent years warning Germans about the enemy. Americans were described as ruthless bombers who had reduced cities like Dresden and Hamburg to ashes. The Soviets were portrayed as vengeful and unstoppable. The message was simple: surrender meant humiliation or worse. But by May 1945, surrender was no longer a choice. It was the only thing left. When WWII and dozens of other women were detained by American forces in southern Germany, the fear was immediate and silent. They had heard stories, some true, some exaggerated, some invented entirely. They expected shouting, rough hands, punishment. Instead, they were searched, documented, and transported to a temporary holding camp. The camp itself was not comfortable. It was surrounded by barbed wire. Guard towers stood at the corners. The barracks were crowded. But it was organized, structured, predictable. For women who had spent months fleeing artillery and air raids, predictability felt almost unreal. Yet fear lingered. These women were not only prisoners of war, they were symbols of a defeated nation. Some had lost husbands at the front. Some had lost homes to bombing. Many carried guilt, personal or collective, about what Germany had become. The psychological state inside those barbed wire fences was complicated. Shame, relief, anger, exhaustion. Hunger, however, was universal. Years of rationing had reshaped their bodies. Bread lines had become part of daily life as early as 1942. By 1945, the official ration for many civilians had fallen drastically. Black market trading flourished. A handful of sugar could be exchanged for valuables. For children especially, sweets had vanished from memory. For WWII, the loss of sugar was more than nutritional, it was symbolic. Sugar meant celebration, birthdays, weddings,
Christmas stollen dusted white like snow. Without it, even baking had become mechanical, survival rather than craft. Now, sitting behind American barbed wire, she did not think about politics or ideology. She thought about food, about whether prisoners would be fed enough to survive, about whether captivity would mean starvation or something worse. Across Europe in 1945, millions were displaced. It is estimated that by the war's end, over 11 million German soldiers had been taken prisoner by Allied forces. Among them were thousands of women who had served in support roles. Their fate varied depending on which army captured them. The uncertainty was terrifying. What none of them expected was kindness. But kindness at this stage was only a rumor, as fragile as the paper identification tags hanging from their coats. In those first days inside the American camp, the women whispered at night. Would they be sent east? Would they be tried? Would they ever see their families again? And, most pressing of all, would they eat tomorrow? Hunger strips away ideology. It reduces the world to one question: survive or not. Roswitha, who once measured flour with precision and pride, now measured time between meals. She watched the camp kitchens carefully. She noticed sacks being unloaded. She noticed smells drifting across the yard, unfamiliar, almost sweet, but she refused to hope. Hope had become dangerous in the final months of the Reich. Germany had promised victory and delivered ruin. It had promised strength and delivered starvation. It had promised permanence and delivered surrender. Behind the wire, the women waited, not knowing that something as simple as flour, butter, and sugar, ingredients absent for years, would soon challenge everything they believed about their enemy. At the bitter end of the Reich, the war was over, but the real transformation, the quiet one, the human one, had not yet begun.
When the trucks finally stopped, no one spoke. The women had been riding for hours, maybe longer. Time had blurred into the rhythm of wheels over broken roads. Dust clung to their coats. Some still wore fragments of uniforms. Others had tried to disguise themselves in civilian scarves and worn-out dresses. But the Americans knew who they were. The gates opened with a metallic groan. Barbed wire stretched in careful lines across a field that had once been farmland. Wooden barracks stood in rows. Watchtowers marked each corner like silent sentinels. To women raised on years of propaganda, this looked exactly like the beginning of a nightmare. They stepped down one by one. No one shouted at them. No one struck them. Instead, their names were written down. Their belongings were collected and cataloged. Each woman received a number. The process was efficient, almost impersonal. That frightened them more than rage would have. They had expected revenge. For years, German civilians had been shown images of bombed cities and told that the enemy was merciless. They had heard that American soldiers hated them, that captivity meant humiliation, that surrender meant dishonor. Now they stood inside an American prisoner of war camp, waiting for something terrible to happen. Nothing did. That silence, that absence of violence, created its own kind of tension. Inside the barracks, the air smelled of wood, wool, and damp earth. The bunks were narrow but orderly. There were blankets, real blankets, not scraps sewn together from old coats. Some women stared at them as if unsure whether they were allowed to touch them. Roswitha sat on the lower bunk nearest the door. Her hands, once steady enough to pipe frosting in perfect spirals, trembled slightly. She told herself it was from exhaustion, but it wasn't only that. It was the waiting. The human mind, conditioned for fear, does not immediately accept safety. During the last months of the war, fear had become constant. Air raid sirens, explosions in the distance, news of advancing armies, stories whispered and exaggerated of what happened to women in conquered territories. Whether all of those stories were true did not matter. They shaped expectation. Now, inside American custody, expectation was everything.
The first meal came sooner than anyone anticipated. Metal containers were carried into the compound. Guards instructed them to line up. The women hesitated. Hunger pulled them forward. Pride held them back. Roswitha noticed something immediately: the smell. It was not the thin, watery cabbage soup she had grown used to in the final winter of the Reich. It was thicker, richer. There was actual bread, pale, soft bread, not the dense gray loaves made from substitute grains. She swallowed. For years she had rationed ingredients in her mind. How many grams of sugar remained? Could butter be stretched with water? Could sweetness be simulated with beet syrup? War had turned baking into chemistry, into compromise. Here, in captivity, compromise seemed unnecessary. But she did not allow herself hope. Hope had betrayed Germany before. Instead, she focused on small certainties: 3 meals, a blanket, no artillery in the distance, no collapsing buildings, no marching orders. Yet beneath the surface, identity struggled. Who were they now? They were no longer part of the Reich. The Reich had surrendered. They were not free civilians either. They were prisoners, women who had served a regime that lay in ruins. Shame mixed with relief. Some women cried quietly at night, not because of mistreatment, but because the war was over and they had survived when so many had not. Survival carries its own burden. Roswitha thought of her hometown, whether it still stood, whether her parents were alive, whether the bakery she trained in was rubble. She imagined returning someday, but return to what? A defeated country divided among occupying powers. Behind barbed wire, a strange realization began to take root. The enemy was not behaving as expected. No shouting, no beatings, no starvation. Only order, only food, only waiting. And in that waiting, something fragile began to grow. Not trust, not yet, but doubt. Doubt about everything they had been told. If the Americans were monsters, why did they follow rules? If surrender meant destruction, why were they being kept alive, fed, and registered carefully? Questions are powerful, more powerful than hunger, more powerful than fear. One afternoon, as Roswitha helped carry buckets near the kitchen area, a gust of wind carried a scent she had not encountered in years. It was faint, sweet, spiced. She froze for a half-second. Cinnamon. The word alone felt dangerous, impossible. She dismissed it as imagination. Sugar had gone too long. Sweetness belonged to another lifetime, before bombings, before ration cards, before surrender. And yet the smell lingered in the air like a promise she dared not to believe. Behind barbed wire, in a defeated nation's aftermath, something unexpected was beginning to form. Not freedom, not forgiveness, something simpler. The possibility that captivity might not mean cruelty. And that possibility frightened them more than anything else.
The first time they saw them, no one moved. The trays were carried out just after midday. Steam rose in soft spirals into the cool spring air. The women had lined up as they always did, silent, cautious, still unsure how much of this routine was permanent. But today, something was different. The smell reached them before the sight did. Warm, sweet, spiced. Not cabbage, not boiled potatoes, not the sour gray bread they had grown used to during the final winters of the war. Cinnamon. Roswitha felt it before she allowed herself to recognize it. Her body reacted first, a tightening in her throat, a sharp memory blooming behind her eyes. It had been years since she had smelled anything like it. Sugar had disappeared from Germany long before the Reich collapsed. By 1943, sweets were luxuries reserved for propaganda displays or high-ranking officials. Ordinary civilians survived on substitutes. Soldiers received rations stripped of indulgence. But this smell was real.
The guards began placing white plates along a long wooden table inside the compound. On each plate sat a spiral of golden dough glazed with icing that melted slightly in the sun. Some of the women thought it was a mistake. Others assumed it was meant for the guards. But then the order came, line up. Roswitha stepped forward slowly. She told herself not to stare, not to show longing. Dignity had become a fragile possession in captivity, but when the plate was set into her hands, she could not look away. The dough was soft, not dense. The glaze was white, real sugar, not beet syrup. The spiral was generous, thick with cinnamon filling. She recognized the craftsmanship instantly. Whoever had baked these understood ratios, timing, patience. Her fingers trembled. Around her, the line moved in stunned silence. No cheering, no laughter, just disbelief. For years, German cities had endured bombing campaigns that shattered bakeries and mills. Transportation networks had been systematically destroyed, making the distribution of ingredients nearly impossible. Civilian ration cards often excluded sugar entirely. Children born in the last years of the war had never tasted proper sweets. Entire holidays passed without cake. Now, behind American barbed wire, cinnamon rolls were being handed out like ordinary food. Roswitha sat down on the wooden bench, the plate balanced carefully on her knees. She stared at the spiral. A memory surfaced uninvited. Pre-war mornings in a small-town bakery, sunlight through glass windows, customers waiting for fresh pastries dusted in powdered sugar, the smell of yeast rising before dawn, the pride of turning raw flour into something that made people close their eyes in quiet happiness. That world had ended, or so she thought. Across from her, a younger woman began to cry silently, not loud sobs, just tears slipping down her face as she held the pastry in both hands. Another prisoner crossed herself before taking a bite. Someone whispered, "I haven't tasted sugar in years." Roswitha lifted the roll slowly. The first bite was almost unbearable. Soft dough gave way under her teeth. Warm cinnamon and melted sugar flooded her mouth. It was overwhelming, not because it was extravagant, but because it was normal. It tasted like peace, like childhood, like a time before ideology had poisoned everything. She closed her eyes. For a moment, the camp disappeared. There was no barbed wire, no guard towers, no surrender documents signed in distant cities. There was only flavor, simple, honest, human. When she opened her eyes, she realized she was crying too. Not from gratitude, not exactly, but from the shock of contrast. They had expected punishment. They had prepared themselves for humiliation. Instead, they were being fed pastries. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. War teaches people to categorize the world in absolutes, us and them, enemy and ally, good and evil. Propaganda sharpens those lines until they feel permanent, but a cinnamon roll does not fit neatly into hatred. Kindness, especially unexpected kindness, creates cognitive dissonance. It forces the mind to reconsider. Why would the enemy share sugar? Sugar during wartime Europe was not trivial. It required functioning agriculture, intact supply chains, industrial processing, transportation. It represented stability, abundance, security. The United States, untouched by battlefield destruction at home, possessed those resources. But resources alone do not dictate generosity. This was a choice. Roswitha studied the icing on her fingers. She noticed that the glaze had been applied evenly. The dough had proofed properly. These were not carelessly assembled rations. They were baked with attention. An American soldier walked past the tables, glancing at the prisoners. He did not mock them. He did not rush them. He simply observed, as if this were routine. Routine. The word echoed in her mind. In Germany's final months, routine had vanished. Every day brought uncertainty.
Air raid sirens, evacuation orders, rumors of advancing fronts, the collapse of authority, the disappearance of neighbors. Nothing felt stable. But here, in captivity, meals came on schedule. Bread was fresh, and now, impossibly, there were cinnamon rolls. The sweetness lingered on her tongue long after she finished. She resisted the urge to lick her fingers, but eventually she did. Around her, others did the same, embarrassed yet unable to waste even a trace. Something shifted that afternoon. Not allegiance, not loyalty, but perception. The enemy had a face now, not just in uniform, but in action. A face that baked. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. No anxious speculation about interrogation, no whispered fears of relocation. Instead, conversations circled around the same astonished question: did you taste the sugar? For some, the experience was painful. It reminded them of what had been lost: homes, families, normal life. For others, it sparked something dangerous: hope. Roswitha lay awake, staring at her hands. She imagined flour between her fingers again, not as rationed survival food, but as craft. She wondered who had baked the rolls: a military cook, a volunteer, someone who had no idea that this small act would unravel years of indoctrination. She understood something in that quiet moment. Food can humiliate, it can starve, it can control, but it can also restore. The cinnamon roll had not erased the war. It had not undone destruction or absolved guilt, but it had pierced through hatred with something disarmingly simple: sweetness. Behind barbed wire, in the ruins of a defeated nation's final chapter, a group of women tasted sugar for the first time in years. And in that sweetness, the certainty of who their enemy was began, quietly, dangerously, to dissolve.
The question began quietly, almost as a whisper between bunks at night. When will they release us? At first, every woman in the barracks assumed captivity was temporary, a holding pattern before interrogation, processing, and eventual return home. That was the natural order of things. Wars ended, prisoners were exchanged, people went back to rebuild. But Germany in 1945 was not a country waiting to receive its citizens with open arms. It was a landscape of ruins divided into occupation zones. Entire cities were flattened. Railways lay twisted and unusable. Farms had been burned or abandoned. Millions were displaced: former soldiers, refugees from the East, civilians fleeing advancing armies. Freedom suddenly did not look like safety. News filtered into the camp slowly. Guards spoke casually among themselves. Newspapers occasionally appeared. The women learned that Berlin had fallen, that the Reich had ceased to exist, that Allied powers were carving Germany into sectors. They also heard darker stories. In the eastern territories, chaos followed the front lines. Reports of violence, reprisals, disappearances. Some of these accounts were confirmed by survivors arriving in western zones. Others were rumors amplified by fear. But fear does not require certainty to feel real. For many of the women in the camp, the idea of being released into that uncertainty was more terrifying than remaining behind barbed wire. Roswitha found herself confronting a thought she never imagined possible. Here, in captivity, she knew when she would eat, she knew where she would sleep, she knew the rules. Outside, there were no guarantees. The human mind craves predictability. After years of sirens and collapsing fronts, predictability felt like mercy. Within weeks, some prisoners were assigned light duties: cleaning barracks, sorting supplies, assisting in kitchens. The Americans, following established policies for POW labor, allowed work that maintained the camp's operation. It was not punishment, it was structure.
When Roswitha was asked if she had baking experience, she hesitated before answering. Yes. The word carried weight. She was escorted to the kitchen area, not as a guest, but not as an enemy either. The American cook, a broad-shouldered man from the Midwest, gestured toward sacks of flour and tins of sugar. He spoke little German, she spoke little English, but baking required no translation. Flour is flour. Yeast is yeast. Water binds everything. For the first time since the war's collapse, Roswitha touched ingredients without calculating how to stretch them. No substitutes, no hidden fillers, real butter, real cinnamon. At first, she kept her movements cautious. She expected supervision, correction, suspicion. Instead, she was watched with curiosity. The American cook seemed amused at how carefully she handled the dough, how she pressed it flat with measured precision. Over time, tension softened. Work became a bridge. Inside the kitchen, identities shifted. She was no longer merely a prisoner of a defeated regime. She was a baker again. And with that identity came something unexpected: dignity. Meanwhile, conversations in the barracks grew more complex. Some women still longed desperately to leave, to search for missing family members. Others hesitated. Where would they go? To bombed-out apartments? To villages now controlled by occupying forces? To food shortages worse than what they had endured during the war? Historically, the immediate post-war period in Germany was marked by severe hardship. The winter of 1945 to 46 would later be remembered as one of the coldest and most desperate. Coal shortages left cities freezing. Malnutrition persisted. Infrastructure had not yet recovered. In contrast, the camp, though confined, functioned. This contrast created a moral tension. Was choosing to remain, even temporarily, an act of cowardice or survival? Some women began volunteering for extended duties, subtly delaying processing. Others requested reassignment to camps known for stable conditions. Officially, they were prisoners awaiting release. Unofficially, a few were choosing captivity over chaos. Roswitha wrestled with guilt. Her homeland lay in ruins. Should she not return and help rebuild? But rebuild what? Under whose authority? And with what resources? Every time she rolled dough in the camp kitchen, she felt the contradiction sharpen. The Americans, once the faceless enemy, now trusted her with ingredients. They tasted her adjustments to recipes. Occasionally, one would nod in approval. Trust. It was a fragile exchange. Outside the camp fences, the political future of Germany was being debated by world leaders. Demilitarization, denazification, division, reconstruction. But inside the kitchen, politics felt distant. There were only measurements, heat, timing. The first time an American soldier thanked her, simply said "good" with a smile, she felt something shift permanently. Hatred requires distance. It requires abstraction. It is easier to despise an idea than a person standing beside you, kneading dough. At night, she would return to the barracks carrying the faint scent of cinnamon on her sleeves. The other women would look at her differently now, not with envy, but with cautious hope. If cooperation was possible in the kitchen, perhaps coexistence was possible beyond the wire. Still, fear lingered. Release dates were uncertain. Processing systems were overwhelmed. Millions of POWs were scattered across Europe. Administrative delays were common. No one knew exactly when their turn would come. And in that uncertainty, a strange comfort formed. Captivity, once synonymous with punishment, had become stability. Roswitha began to understand something profound. Freedom is not only the absence of fences, it is the presence of safety. Behind barbed wire, she had found food, structure, and a quiet rebuilding of identity. Outside those fences waited a shattered nation struggling to define itself. If given the choice, immediate release into ruin or temporary confinement with bread and routine, what would she choose? The question no longer felt hypothetical. For some of the women, the answer was already clear. They were not choosing prison. They were choosing survival.
By late summer of 1945, the war was no longer measured in gunfire. It was measured in paperwork. Lists, transfers, release orders, names called out one by one. The women in the camp had learned to read the rhythm of administration, the shuffle of boots before roll call, the arrival of officers carrying clipboards, the tension in the air when new directives were announced. Each list meant departure. Each departure meant uncertainty. Some left eagerly, clutching their documents like passports back to life. Others walked toward the gate slowly, glancing back at the barracks as if leaving behind something more complicated than prison walls. Roswitha's name did not appear for months. In the kitchen, she had become reliable. The Americans trusted her with early morning preparation. She adjusted yeast quantities depending on the temperature. She corrected measurements with instinct rather than scales. Even language barriers had softened into routine gestures and shared glances. The cinnamon rolls had not been a one-time gesture. They appeared again, sometimes with raisins, sometimes plain. Bread was steady, soup was steady. Sugar, though rationed even in America, existed. And in that steadiness, something larger was forming, something historians would later call reconstruction. After the surrender on May 8, 1945, Germany did not simply return to normal. It entered occupation. The country was divided into zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Infrastructure was shattered. Industrial production had collapsed. Millions of displaced persons wandered across borders that no longer felt fixed. The immediate post-war years were marked by hunger. The winter of 1945 to 46 was brutally cold. In many cities, daily caloric intake dropped to survival levels. Coal shortages meant freezing apartments. Black markets flourished. Cigarettes became currency. Freedom, in practical terms, often meant standing in ration lines again, this time amid ruins. Inside the camp, however, food still arrived predictably. Roswitha wrestled with an uncomfortable truth. Captivity had preserved her strength. It had allowed her to eat regularly. It had restored her craft. It had given her time to think, something war had denied. She began to understand that the cinnamon roll had not been about generosity alone. It had been about policy. The United States, largely untouched domestically by the devastation of ground warfare, possessed the agricultural capacity to feed prisoners. The Geneva Conventions required humane treatment, but beyond law there was also strategy. Stable prisoners meant orderly transitions. Yet strategy did not explain everything. The American cook who once barely acknowledged her now asked questions, simple ones fragmented by accent. "Germany? Bakery?" She nodded. He responded with a thumbs up and pointed at the dough as if to say, "You remember." That recognition mattered. In the barracks, conversations shifted from fear to future. What would Germany become? Would it remain unified? Would democracy return? Could neighbors forgive neighbors? For many of the women, captivity had stripped away illusions. The Reich had promised permanence and delivered destruction. The propaganda that once defined enemies now felt hollow. They had seen Americans up close, not as caricatures, but as young men missing home, tired from war, following orders, baking bread. Hatred does not survive proximity easily. When Roswitha's name was finally called, she felt no surge of triumph. She felt hesitation.
Release meant stepping into a divided nation. It meant searching for family members who might not be alive. It meant facing questions about loyalty, complicity, survival. It meant rebuilding not just buildings, but identity. On her final morning in the kitchen, she rose before dawn as usual. The American cook handed her a small cloth bundle without ceremony. Inside were 2 cinnamon rolls, still warm. "For road," he said. She nodded, unable to find words. At the gate, papers were stamped. A guard pointed toward the road leading west. Beyond it lay towns in rubble, fields waiting to be replanted, governments yet to stabilize. She walked. The first miles felt unreal. No barbed wire behind her, no roll call ahead, only open sky and uncertainty. As she moved through villages, she saw the truth of Germany's condition: roofless houses, burned-out factories, women clearing debris with bare hands, children with hollow cheeks. Freedom was raw and unstructured. In the weeks that followed, she located distant relatives. Her parents' home had been damaged but still stood. The bakery where she had trained was gone, windows shattered, ovens destroyed. The owner had not survived the bombing. So she began again. Post-war Germany would eventually rebuild, aided by reforms, currency stabilization, and later programs like the Marshall Plan. But in those first months, recovery was not grand, it was personal. Clearing rubble brick by brick, sharing recipes with neighbors, trading skills for food. Roswitha used what captivity preserved: her hands, her strength, her knowledge. Sugar was still scarce outside controlled distributions. Butter remained limited. But gradually, as agricultural production stabilized and supply chains improved, ingredients returned to shelves. The first time she baked cinnamon rolls in her own rebuilt oven, years later, she stood very still as the scent filled the room. It carried memory, not only of childhood, but of barbed wire and unexpected mercy. Her grandchildren would later ask her about the war. They expected stories of bombs and fear. She told them those too, but she always returned to one image: a wooden table inside a prisoner of war camp, a spiral of dough glazed white, and the moment she realized the enemy was human. It wasn't the sugar, she would say quietly. It was the choice to share it. Wars are remembered for battles and treaties, for dates and leaders, but sometimes history shifts in smaller spaces, in kitchens, in camps, in the quiet decision to treat a defeated opponent with dignity. In 1945, millions suffered, millions starved, millions were displaced. The destruction was real, vast, undeniable. But so was this: a simple pastry handed across a line once defined by hatred became proof that rebuilding could begin long before nations signed agreements. It could begin with flour, with butter, with sugar, and with the fragile courage to believe that sweetness, even after the bitterest ending, could return.